Hello again, everyone. This is Professor Casey. Today we're talking about Chapter 10, adapted from David Emory Shi's America: A Narrative History, and this is the period where Andrew Jackson and his associates take over the White House, sometimes just called the Jacksonian era. Now, starting with Andrew Jackson, politics takes a left turn into something akin to popular entertainment. Okay, we have a completely new way of politicians interacting with the public, the way that they begin to promote themselves and their own political parties. Jackson, in particular, really starts to advocate campaigning for votes from not only the common people, but also lobbying congressmen and putting pressure on other politicians to help support him. And his target here, in terms of his constituency, is what he just simply refers to as the common man. Okay, and his definition of this is white working class men. Okay. And all of his campaigns are actually run specifically by his choice for Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren, who does eventually become president later on as well. And most of the major criticisms surrounding Andrew Jackson's presidency, his approach to it, his approach to the American people, include the fact that just about anyone who is not a white male is targeted for some form of violation of political and civil rights. Okay? And this includes African Americans and Native Americans and also women, regardless of their skin color. Okay? And ironically here, even though Jackson initially is viewed as something of a sectionalist because he is a Southerner, Southern slave owners are actually concerned about his implementation of democratization in the United States because they're worried it's going to end up undoing slavery altogether. And his entire approach to becoming president here is to increase executive power as much as he possibly can at the expense of the other two branches of government. Okay? He believes that the president is supposed to be superior to Congress because he believes Congress represents the elite. Okay? And the president is supposed to be some kind of last man standing, last defense between the elite and the common people. And over time, he begins replacing all federal officials with people who support him. This is known as the spoils system. And it actually is a key feature of the Republican Party in the later part of the 19th century. And of course, in many cases, we still see it even into the common period today. He also cuts a lot of federal spending here and is the only president we have in the entire history of the country to pay off the national debt. Okay, so that is one thing that we can actually attribute to him in a positive manner. And Jackson's presidency is very quickly embroiled in all kinds of conflict. Okay? His cabinet is divided in loyalties between his vice president, John C. Calhoun, and Martin Van Buren, okay, when it comes to the presidential succession. Okay? So people are already beginning to look toward the future in terms of who is going to end up becoming president after Jackson leaves office. And Van Buren here is a nationalist, okay? He is the one who kind of ends up convincing Jackson to take a national stance in order to gain the most votes. And John C. Calhoun, of course, is more of a sectionalist because he comes from the South. Now, the series of events that Jackson is probably most well known for in an infamous way here is called the Indian Removal Act. His view towards Native Americans is that he believes them to be barbarians. Okay? He has already had multiple encounters, armed conflicts with them throughout the War of 1812. We've seen him fight them during the Creek War. He's fought the Seminole in Florida. And he believes that they need to be treated as subjects rather than independent nations. Because at this point in time, and well into the 1920s even, not until 1924, are Native Americans actually considered citizens of the United States. They're considered, up until then, to be citizens of their own independent Indian nations. Okay? And Jackson believes that the best course of action here is to pick up all of the Native Americans and move them west of the Mississippi River, because at this point in time, most of the area west of the Mississippi is simply open territory. It hasn't been divided up into states yet. And he begins referring to himself in a very almost sadistic way here as the Great Father. Okay, he starts to believe himself to be the father of all of these Native American tribes, and it's very condescending to Native Americans. Okay, to view him as being a father figure of any kind, in this case, more like an abusive father than anything else. And in many cases, southern states began to actually abolish tribal units. They began rejecting the application of civil rights to Native Americans. They began seizing ancestral lands, and they deny suffrage. So Native Americans are not allowed to vote. They're not allowed to hold office or have any kind of political acumen of any sort. And in 1830, Jackson institutes the Indian Removal Act. This is the official legal justification that he brings forward to pack up all Native Americans west of the Mississippi. Okay? And he claims that he's going to relocate all Indian tribes to federal lands west of the river and is going to promise to pay for travel and settlement, although it never fully comes to fruition the way that he promises. And of course, Congress debates this very, very heavily, even though it does ultimately end up passing. Okay? Northern tribes are very quick to relent, but certain tribes like the Sauk and the Fox tribes in particular end up resisting, and we do end with armed conflicts. Okay? The Black Hawk War in 1832 is one in particular, involves the leader Black Hawk, who you see here. He's the chief of a Sauk tribe. And the Sauk and the whites end up coming into armed conflict when the Sauk refuse to move. Okay? And this, of course, ends up leading to something called the Bad Axe Massacre, where a group of white soldiers end up murdering several hundred women and children who were actually attempting to escape and really surrender in the Wisconsin territory. So kind of the beginning of using federal troops to end up squashing Native American tribes and preventing them from living independently. Osceola is another famous figure who we'll see during this time period. He's the leader of the Seminole tribe, and he actually wages war against the government in Florida and ends up killing over 1,500 whites in the course of 8 years. And Osceola and the Seminole are able to actually hide out in the Florida Everglades, okay, which is basically a no man's land, right? If you're not familiar with the area, it's very easy to get lost and disappear into the swamps, and no one will ever hear from you again. And it's worth noting, too, that the Seminole do not end their war with the United States until 1934. Okay, so this is a very long, drawn-out conflict with a lot of bad blood attached. Now, the most famous single event in the aftermath of the Indian Removal Act is the Trail of Tears, right? This is what most people are familiar with in terms of its relation to the Cherokee. Okay? And the Cherokee tribe occupies a significant portion of the South at this period in time, from Georgia throughout Alabama, Tennessee, and North Carolina. And in 1827, the Cherokee actually do something unprecedented when it comes to Native American tribes and activities here, because they actually adopt their own independent constitution and declare themselves not subject to any U.S. laws or control, right? They actually try to establish their region as an independent portion of the United States. All that ends up changing, though, in 1829 when the U.S. government discovers gold on Cherokee land. Okay? The very next year, Georgia announces that all Cherokee members are going to either comply or be forced into disfranchisement. Okay, they're going to be stripped of their voting rights. This leads to the court case of Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. Okay, and the head Justice Marshall ends up ruling favorably for the Cherokee, but doesn't render a verdict on a small technicality. And Jackson, of course, is completely against what Marshall ends up doing here. To even think that the U.S. government would come down in favor of Native Americans is appalling in Jackson's eyes. And he actually steps in and tries to overrule the situation by giving the Cherokee an ultimatum. He says, you either live under law here in Georgia or you pack up and leave. And the Cherokee, in this point in time, is one of the most assimilated tribal units in the United States. Okay, they've built their own schools and churches. They wear white Western European clothing. They marry with whites, and in some cases, they even own slaves. Now, in 1838, well after Jackson ends up leaving office, 17,000 Cherokee are actually evicted entirely from their native lands and are marched under guard for over 800 miles into the Oklahoma Territory. And this is the event that we call the Trail of Tears. Okay, and it's called that, of course, not just because they have to leave their land, but because several hundred, and even I think well into the thousands of Cherokee end up dying along the way. Because they're marched into the dead of winter, they're carrying young children and infants on their backs. Many of them die of exposure or illness or simply mistreatment. Okay? If they fall down onto the ground, the soldiers will tell them to keep going and not even pick up their loved ones. Here's the exact numbers: 4,000 deaths along the way. Okay? So a significant portion of people. Now, there is still a minor remnant of Cherokee that end up hiding out in the North Carolina mountains. They're just referred to as the Eastern Band, okay? And there's still a presence of them in the eastern portion of the U.S. even today. And between the 1820s and the 1830s, 100,000 Eastern Native Americans are relocated west of the Mississippi River, and most of them are settled somewhere in the Oklahoma Territory. Some of them even moved north into the Dakotas. And approximately 1 million acres of native land is taken by the U.S. government and sold. Now, the first other major instance that occurs in Jackson's administration here in terms of controversy involves the Bank of the United States. Okay, because again, we had the first Bank of the U.S. Charter allowed to expire in 1811. This led to a big embroiled conflict with the economy, and then it's reinvented in 1816 as the Second Bank of the United States. Now, the second bank is actually a private corporation that has public responsibilities. Okay, it's slightly different from the first iteration. Okay, and it ends up competing with state and local banks for business. Okay, it makes loans to individuals, to businesses, and to state banks. Okay, so it actually has its fingers in a lot of different areas here. And it's supposed to promote a stable economy by backing up all the paper money production with gold and silver coins. Okay, this is supposed to be how we have it in the United States. Okay, any paper money that's printed up, we have a certain measure of collateral, right? Some kind of gold or silver that's supposed to end up backing it up here. Now, by 1825, half of all of the unregulated state banks that are established between 1810 and 1820 end up going bankrupt because they refuse to either submit to the authority of the Bank of the U.S. or simply because of competition with it. And the Bank of the U.S. is supposed to be something to regulate and monitor all state banks to try to prevent overextension from happening, okay? Because we've already seen this happen a time or two, and it ends up wreaking havoc on the economy. And most state banks are actually resentful of the Bank of the U.S. They're worried that it's going to create a monopoly, especially in the South, and that it's going to end up becoming the source of tyranny in the U.S., that it's going to end up overextending itself, and somehow the U.S. government is going to take control of the entire money source of the country and do whatever it wants. Now, in 1832, Congress passes the re-charter bill for the bank, and Jackson comes out and has it vetoed. Okay, this is where he turns a little bit sectionalist briefly. Okay, he starts to say that the Bank of the U.S. is a tool of oppression, okay, that it's something that's going to end up affecting the middle and working classes in the U.S. and is going to give more power to the wealthy. Okay, this is what causes him to be so appealing to his constituency. Okay, this is what allows him to be both a nationalist and a sectionalist at the same time. And most of Jackson's enemies believe that he is really trying to consolidate power here, that he's trying to bring a large government entity under his own auspices, which in reality is what he. Now, the next big thing that occurs here, and this is something that really begins to reveal the bad blood between the North and the South, and very nearly gets us involved in a civil war about 20 years, 20 or 30 years really, before the actual Civil War occurs. Jackson already has a reputation for being this, monarchist almost in his attitude toward Congress, right? He looks down his nose at them, doesn't want to listen to what they have to say, believes himself to be the ultimate authority in the country. And he ends up vetoing 12 congressional bills in total. Okay, so this is a very large amount just in his first term in office. And again, he believes that the president represents the will of the people because he believes because he's been elected, they have given him the authority to be such. Now, after this big national depression that happened in 1819 and the Tariff of Abominations that we had in 1828, the South is really in a pretty poor state. Okay, they're not able to import the goods that they need or that they want, and they believe that their economy is hurting because they can no longer really transport things overseas without having to pay heavy taxes. And so John C. Calhoun, the vice president, argues that this tariff of abominations merits nullification, okay, which in other words means it needs to be considered null and void by the states that it impacts so negatively. Okay, so South Carolina in particular starts saying, we believe that we don't need to, apply this government law to ourselves because it's hurting us so much. Now, Robert Hayne, who is a South Carolina senator, argues for the state's rights to do this. Okay? He believes that the state somehow should be able to nullify federal law, okay? And he thinks that the North is oppressing the South by allowing this to happen. Okay? And this is something that's an age-old issue by this point, right? That the federal government has full authority over state governments, okay? And state governments, by this point, have been constantly trying to overrule the federal government, and according to the Constitution, they're not allowed to. And of course, Daniel Webster, who we've already seen, right, he's a Massachusetts state senator, challenges Hayne here and says that the South is actually trying to get us embroiled in a civil war by challenging the federal government. He says, if you're not willing to let this drop, it's going to turn into an armed conflict. And eventually it comes down to Jackson and his own vice president, John C. Calhoun here. Okay? Jackson is sympathetic to what the Southerners are going through here, and tries to play up as much of a sectionalist view as he possibly can, but once they start to threaten nullification, then he turns into a nationalist and goes back on his promise to them, okay? And says that they are actually on the verge of committing treason. Okay? So Jackson ends up confronting his vice president in 1830, and Martin Van Buren intervenes by staging a coup in the cabinet. Okay? He causes John Eaton, the Secretary of War, to resign. Van Buren himself resigns very strategically 4 days later. And Calhoun's supporters, Samuel Ingham, who's the Secretary of the Treasury, and John Berrien, who's the Attorney General, are both forced by Jackson to also resign. So virtually the entire presidential cabinet resigns here. And the American people don't really realize what's going on here, and they begin to mock Jackson for being incompetent because all of a sudden his entire cabinet has disbanded, okay? And they start printing up political cartoons of rats jumping ship. The following year, though, Jackson decides he's going to refill his entire cabinet with his own political supporters, okay? And in particular, he starts hiring his close friends, including Martin Van Buren. Okay, and Van Buren in particular becomes his vice president. Okay, and he starts to refer to this as his kitchen cabinet. Okay, these are basically people who are supporters and friends of his. Right, this is again a key feature of the spoil system. Now, a quick little side note that occurs here in the 1832 election when Jackson is up for re-election is a strange episode that involves the first time a third political party comes into the mix. Okay, we haven't had this yet. And it's called the Anti-Masonic Party. It has to do with the Masonic Lodge and the American people's growing reticence toward it. Okay, they're worried so much about its exclusive tendencies, its secretiveness, and it starts to spiral out of control when rumors begin to abound about crimes, murder, and intrigue here. Surrounds the figure of a man named William Morgan, who is a former Mason who has been kicked out of the organization, defrocked is what they refer to it as, because he becomes unemployed and can no longer hold a job. Okay? And Morgan believes that he's been stabbed in the back by the Masons, and he ends up courting revenge here by printing up a pamphlet and distributing it to the American public that reveals all of the secrets of the Masonic Lodge, which of course at this point is a big no-no. Okay? The Masons end up attempting to burn his print shop, and they have him arrested for indebtedness. Okay, this is still the period in time where there are debtors' prisons. And he is mysteriously bailed out of debtors' prison here and completely disappears, okay, until a year later when his decomposing body is found. Okay. Now people begin to suspect that the Masons are very exclusively behind this, that they have had him imprisoned, released, captured, murdered, and now people begin to really fear the Masons and all other major, secret societies. And so this anti-Masonic party ends up forming here. Okay, it's helmed by a group of rural evangelical Protestants, people who tend to be abolitionist in their views. And it's the first political party to actually hold a national convention to nominate a presidential candidate. Okay, this is what we have today with the major political parties. So we have the anti-Masonic party to thank for this. And it's also the first to announce a very specific policy platform. Okay, most political parties have not done this yet either. Okay. And also, most of the third political parties that we begin to see from this point going forward tend to adopt a very specific platform when it comes to why they're actually running their own candidate. Okay, whether it's for a certain social problem, right? You might have one running for temperance or one running for workers' rights or something along those lines. But it typically occurs in that regard. And of course, the Democrats and the Republicans began holding their own national conventions in imitation of this. It gives the American people a greater role in nominating candidates. And so now we have Henry Clay as the Republican candidate, right? He's the Speaker of the House. And we have Jackson and Van Buren as Democratic running mates. Now, in 1831, right before this ends up occurring, Jackson requests that Congress try to reduce tariff rates in South Carolina to appease them. Okay, this is his way of avoiding this potential Civil War conflict that we could get into over nullification. The Tariff of 1832 does lower a few rates, but it keeps specifically British cotton fabric and clothing with high interest rates. Okay, so this ends up affecting the states even more in a way that they were trying to avoid. And of course, South Carolina ends up, getting into a very big tizzy over this, right? John C. Calhoun in particular begins to worry if Congress is going to be able to end slavery by doing something like this, right? Could they actually, put forth some kind of law or amendment to the Constitution to do so? Ultimately, that is what ends up happening. Now, in November of 1832, right, in the midst of the election, no doubt, South Carolina passes what it calls the Ordinance of Nullification, declaring all of the tariffs that were affecting it negatively to be null and void, right? They are actually trying to overrule the federal government. And they threaten to secede from the Union if the federal government tries to collect any revenues by force. So they are actually firing the first shot here. Robert Hayne, meanwhile, the supporter of all this, is elected governor of the state. Okay? And John C. Calhoun ends up replacing Hayne as the U.S. senator. Okay? So this ends up, basically drawing a line in the sand. And Jackson, meanwhile, is threatening all-out war. He says that if this does happen, then he aims to hang John C. Calhoun. And the southern states began to sympathize with South Carolina while remaining loyal to the Union. So even though the rest of the South believes that South Carolina is, legitimately doing this, they are not willing to come to its aid if war does break out. So it's, the South is not fully prepared to go to war emotionally or mentally quite yet. Okay, so it's probably one of the only reasons we avoided this. Jackson goes so far as to actually send federal forces into Charleston, South Carolina to protect the federal customs house because he believes that South Carolina is going to end up coming in and taking over, right? They're going to try to, force federal agents out and try to, shoot anybody who intervenes. Hayne tries to mobilize the South Carolina militia in response, and Jackson requests the use of force to actually end the issue, okay? Calhoun goes back and forth with Jackson, threatens that Jackson is threatening South Carolina, and the South Carolina legislature tries to hold out for a better option before it actually implements this. Okay, so even though the ardent supporters of this are trying to threaten the federal government, not everybody is on board with getting into such a conflict yet. So it takes Henry Clay, who is senator from Kentucky, right, former Speaker of the House, to arbitrate the conflict and try to bring some kind of compromise here. And both sides agreed to reduce tariff rates over the course of several years to cool things down. The Nullification Ordinance and Force Bill are both dissolved, okay, and this actually ends up preventing war in an official capacity. Okay, so we get right to the brink of it and then get pulled back. 2 days later, Jackson is sworn in for a second term in office, and he actually predicts that slavery is going to be the next big issue. Now, Jackson being reelected as president for a second term is something that he views as a public outcry against the Bank of the United States, for whatever reason. Okay? He begins to believe his own press releases, so to speak. And he orders the Secretary of the Treasury to transfer all federal funds from the national bank into state banks. Okay? He believes that this will prove his point and that he can actually dissolve this government entity. Now, the head of the Bank of the United States orders an end to all the loans and tells the state banks to exchange paper money for gold and silver coins. Okay? He says that if we do this, we can create a depression and prove that Jackson is wrong, okay? And say that we actually do need a bank to regulate local banks. And John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay step in 1834 and convince the Senate to censure Jackson for doing this, right? To basically slap him on the wrist and say, you don't need to intervene in something like this. This is not your field. And Jackson's opponents begin to dub him King Andrew I because he begins to act like a tyrannical king here. And Jackson's supporters are nicknamed Tories. His opponents, meanwhile, end up forming what is called the Whig Party. Okay? And this is grown out of the National Republican Party. So this is, again, another period in time where the Republican Party ends up dissolving for a couple of decades and is replaced by the Whig Party. So now we have Whigs on one side and Democrats on the other side for the next couple of decades. And the Whigs are economic nationalists. They want the federal government to support manufacturing, a national bank, roads, and so forth. They're typically a Protestant majority. They promote more social reforms and are typically abolitionists. Okay, so they typically are the more liberal party at this point in time, whereas the Democratic Party is actually the more conservative. Okay, a little bit of a reversal in attitudes from what we see today. And again, for the next 20 years, this is the dynamic. In 1841, the Bank of the U.S. shuts down and ends up actually removing central banking from America until we get to the dawn of World War I in 1914. Meanwhile, Jackson is targeted for possibly impeachment, and he actually has at least one assassination attempt on him. A man walks up and attempts to shoot Jackson in the back, I believe at a rail station. He either misses or gives Jackson a flesh wound, and Jackson proceeds to beat the man senseless with his walking stick. Okay, so the man is arrested and tried, and I'm not exactly sure what happens to him after that, in fact. The lack of a national bank, meanwhile, leads to a lot of debt accumulation in the country, and we end up spiraling into an economic depression. So in reality, Jackson is proved wrong in the long run here, and that a national bank system could have prevented this. In 1835, the Treasury Department begins to use land sale surpluses to pay off the national debt. Okay? This is actually, again, the first and only time this ever ends up happening in U.S. history. The following year, Congress approves what's called the Distribution Act, and this is supposed to reroute all surplus federal funds to state banks according to their representation in Congress. Okay? And it's supposed to fund more infrastructural projects like the roads and the bridges and so forth, and promote free public schools. Jackson also presents what he refers to as the Specie Circular. This is a little pamphlet that requires all specie, which means gold and silver coins, to be used for land purchases by speculators, okay, to have actual hard currency used so that we're not getting into too much speculation here, okay? We don't want to rack up too much debt, in other words. And what this ultimately ends up doing, though, is it strains the gold and silver supply of the country, because now all of a sudden gold and silver coins are in high demand. And it causes people to want to migrate west more, begin investing in mining, and so forth. It's part of the reason why we end up with more western expansion. Fewer loans are issued, more economic strain, and recessions end up ensuing in the aftermath. So it takes a while for the country to catch up in terms of bridging the gap here. In 1835, a group of northern abolitionists start circulating anti-slavery pamphlets via mail. Okay? And this doesn't only go into the north, they also begin circulating it in the south as well. Okay? And South Carolinians who are pro-slavery actually go so far as to break into the post office and burn the pamphlets. Okay, so they're very vehemently opposed to this being used. And Jackson tries to get Congress to censor the mail, but they refuse to do so by virtue of the First Amendment of the Constitution, right to freedom of speech. And of course, there's a greater bipartisan support here for the sanctity of the mail, okay? And this ends up being a victory for abolitionists in the long run, okay? Makes Jackson look pretty bad. Now, in 1835, Jacksonian Democrats end up nominating Martin Van Buren for their presidential candidate. Okay? He is Jackson's choice to succeed him in office. And the Whigs nominate Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, Hugh Lawson White of Tennessee, and William Henry Harrison of Indiana. Okay. Van Buren manages to defeat all of the Whig candidates with 170 votes from the Electoral College to 113 collectively among the other three, okay, and he becomes the 8th president of the U.S. He's the first New Yorker elected president, and he's given the nickname the Little Magician because he has such a manipulative nature. And he promises to basically continue all of Jackson's projects and all of his politics. Now, in 1837, we have another economic panic. Okay? And this happens when the state banks refuse to convert paper money into the scarce number of coins. Okay? We're already starting to look at the fact that the coin shortage is going to lead to an economic depression either way. Okay? And again, part of this has to do with Jackson's specie circular. So this leads us into a 7-year economic depression that, again, we refer to as the Panic of 1837. Okay? And to make matters worse, the British end up going into a depression during the 1830s as well. Okay? And this leads to a larger lack of coins, which also leads to fewer loans, and all of a sudden, the British are no longer trading as much with America because it's so expensive because of all the tariffs. So cotton prices turn out to plummet. Okay? More and more people end up being foreclosed upon by creditors, and it leads to decreased government spending. Okay, so all of a sudden, the economy suddenly just implodes on itself. 40% of all state banks shut down, 90% of factories in the U.S. close, and 1/3 of the nation is unemployed now. Wages are cut between 30 and 50% over 2 years, and the cost of living ends up skyrocketing. So suddenly people are more and more homeless. They don't know what to do anymore. And many Southerners actually end up fleeing to Mexican-controlled Texas to avoid paying debts. Okay, so a lot of the early settlers in Texas are actually fleeing debt and the federal government in some cases. Meanwhile, Martin Van Buren refuses to grant any kind of federal aid and states that all relief should come specifically from state governments. Okay, so he's trying to wash his hands of the situation here. The Whigs, meanwhile, insist that the federal government should be obligated to provide any aid and say that Martin Van Buren is simply being a heartless individual by doing this. Now, in 1837, Martin Van Buren decides he's not going to try to annex Texas simply to avoid war with Mexico. Again, we're in the midst of a gigantic economic depression at this point, and to get involved in a war would simply cause the national debt to rise, could create a lot of protests due to the raise in taxes, and is simply not a viable option. And of course, Southern Democrats who are trying their best to put on a face of being wealthy individuals here stir up a lot of criticism for this. They think that he's being too much of a coward by not getting involved. And suddenly his popularity begins to go further and further on the decline. Okay? He's already simply riding on Jackson's coattails by this point. Meanwhile, the Whigs pass on Henry Clay for their nominee because they believe he's a little bit too controversial of a figure, and they choose William Henry Harrison as their candidate. Okay? Remember, Harrison was a hero during the War of 1812, just like Andrew Jackson was. Unfortunately, Harrison is getting on in years. Okay, he's getting well into his I believe it's his 60s or 70s by this point, which at this point in time was pretty aged, right? Most people didn't live that long anyway. And he's characterized as being a very simple man, more of a common person than Martin Van Buren, who is an aristocrat claiming to represent the common people. And John Tyler is chosen as Harrison's vice president. Okay? Harrison manages to defeat Martin Van Buren with 234 electoral votes to only 60. Okay, so very large deficit there. Over 80% of white men in the country end up voting in this election too. Okay, so this is a large spike in voter. In all, in the Jacksonian era, we have a lot of different features that make it very important in American history. For one thing, we have a completely unregulated economy. Okay? We have a lot of heavy industrialization, cities are growing more and more, and the tensions between the North and the South almost end up reaching a boiling point. Okay? We have a lot of westward expansion, in part because of the unregulated economy and industrialization. And we now have a new two-party system between Democrats and Whigs. Trade with England does lead to a lot of new enterprises and economic boom, right? Creates a lot more transportation options, including steam power and the railroad. And Jackson's contributions to all of this are both good and bad. Okay? He does invent the Democratic Party. He further democratizes American life and does enable labor unions. Okay? And his biggest accomplishment, again, something that no other president has managed to do, is he does pay off the national debt. Unfortunately, though, his faults very quickly outweigh all of his accomplishments. He is very ardently a racist and refers to America as a white man's democracy. He gets involved in political nepotism, completely kicks out all members of his cabinet and replaces them with his own supporters. He's very temperamental and very, very reactionary, and is very defiant of the Constitution. And ultimately, he triggers an economic depression that ends up, spilling over into future presidential administrations.